Putin is being blamed by the US. After a week of turmoil in Russia over the future of Vladimir Putin's leadership, President Joe Biden said his administration was responding to ensure America and its allies were not blamed. President briefed on what had happened in the last 72 hours in Russia, where Wagner Group mercenaries captured a major center of Russian defense before turning their lines to the capital. Mr. Biden told reporters he called his U.S. friends in Europe to discuss the political impact of the crisis and to make sure we all agree. It is important that we control our reaction and fulfill our expectations, he said, adding that the meeting leaders agreed on what he could do for Vladimir Putin, adding that there is no excuse for that. Blame the West or blame. We've made it clear we're not involved, he added. We have nothing to do with this. It is part of the struggle in the Russian system. Too early to come to a conclusion on development. But no matter what happens next, I will continue to make sure that our friends and partners are careful when interpreting and reacting to the situation. Recounting the phone call he had with the President of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, he added that he assured the President of Ukraine that the United States would stay above Ukraine, regardless of Russia's outcome. The President's comments came after the White House and the general government watched events in Russia closely but quietly over the weekend. The Pentagon announced on Saturday that the United States was committed to protecting Ukraine, but did not elaborate on its overall vision for the ability of U.S. intelligence and defense officials to liaise with the addition of the Putin government. Facing the Nation says the incident raises questions about where Putin holds power. Mr. Lincoln. We haven't seen the end. We're looking closely. He added that the opposition saw a real crack in Russian President Vladimir Putin's power structure and questioned his ability to hold power. Questions. Meanwhile, commentators outside the US and European governments took to the radio to announce the end of Putin's Russian government, and predicted that further declines in Ukraine would reveal the deep-seated conflict power of the government, which argued that the weekend was already not enough. Kremlin statement showing that Wagnerian coup leader Yevgeny Prigozhin fought at the last moment to prevent bloodshed in Moscow and deported him to Belarus. Experts predict that the possibility of Putin being forced to take over the country will arise next day. In the mid-1970s, when Joe Biden became the first senator, President Gerald Ford asked Americans to install Stop Inflation Now, win buttons and stickers. Ford's efforts to raise awareness of rising prices and force Americans to spend less drew much criticism in the media, and even caused suspicion among experts in the White House. Biden sees inflation as a key factor in Democratic presidential candidate Jimmy Carter's victory over Ford. With Biden becoming president after 36 years and 8 years as vice president in the Senate, inflation is now too close to the peak of the disco era to worry about. 7. Rising inflation. Inflation reached 9% last year, the highest level since January 1982, according to a February report from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. This puts Biden and the Democrats in a critical position ahead of the November elections. But Biden, whose poll numbers skyrocketed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, thinks he has one person to blame for the monster problem, Vladimir Putin. President Biden on Thursday blamed the Russian president for the rapid rise in U.S. oil prices, as he blamed the rise in oil prices earlier this week. Unfortunately for Biden, this strategy is unlikely to work. As seen from the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue over 4 years ago, inflation will increase the political clout of the heads of both parties who are unable to use the rate as a geopolitical outlet. There is no doubt that Biden may have caused some economic losses due to his response to the Russian war. Biden on Friday called for the suspension of normal trade relations with Russia, which, if approved by Congress, would allow the U.S. to impose sanctions on Russia from the European Union and U.S. group of 7 countries. Biden said that after general bans on oil, gas, and coal and sanctions on some Russian banks, the U.S. will also restrict imports of Russian diamonds, seafood, and vodka. These include the removal of many Russian banks from SWIFT, International Financial Information System, which is the basis of world trade. However, the negative economic impact of these actions on the American people will be limited because Russia is not an important country for the United States. We exchange partner. Likewise, Russia's exports of crude oil and petroleum products to the United States account for only 8% of total oil production, and less than 2% of products in the United States. In fact, these moves can be beneficial for the economy. They have a very positive effect, showing the U.S. determination to support Ukraine against Russian aggression, which can stimulate people's business confidence, and the American economy is booming. The rapid increase in natural gas prices has recently increased financial concerns. Gasoline prices rose 6% in February. That's up 6% from last month and nearly 40% in 1 year. Given Russia's importance to the energy industry and the relationship between oil restrictions and rising oil prices, Biden may make it easier for Americans to blame Putin for their breast pump pain. This is because voters at least know more about the tides of gasoline prices, which are often based on oil prices, a global commodity. That's not to say that high gas prices, whose members are often blamed for being elected to power in the federal government, won't be a headache for Democrats, but they're unlikely to be fatal. Inflation is another story. Inflation plagued Carter during his tenure, reaching 14.6% between March and April 1980. Carter later lost in a landslide to Republican Ronald Reagan, which led to America's inflation being a major factor in its competitiveness. But it turns out that the price of oil by itself is generally not such a powerful weapon. Gas prices last rose in the summer of 2008, and Republicans struggled to control the Democratic Senate and House majority. At the beginning of 2012, when oil prices were high, they tried to do the same thing again. However, Democratic presidential candidate Barack Obama won easily in both cases. Most American voters today do not value inflation in any meaningful way, and inflation has generally fallen over the past 4 decades. In fact, no one under 45 really remembers the effects of the price acceleration of the Ford and Carter years. So now the price crisis is worrying. It's also possible that gasoline prices will drop, although it seems unlikely in the short term, about 8 months before Election Day. Not so with inflation. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said on Thursday that Americans could again face very severe shocks. The White House Council of Business Advisors delivered a similar message this week. In a recent poll, 55% of voters said that inflation was very important in this year's congressional elections. This is the big problem Biden is trying to solve by pointing to Putin. Today's economic report is a reminder that the U.S. budget is expanding from high rates and households are starting to feel the impact of Putin's rate hikes, Biden said on Thursday after the Labor Department reported a 7.9% increase in consumer spending. Said. But there is reason to doubt that the majority of Americans will accept this excuse. Inflation had been rising for 6 months before Russia entered Ukraine. GOP critics are trying to discredit Biden,